Alexandria, in the early 5th century, was a city that felt like the world in miniature, and like the world was starting to crack. Its harbor pulled in grain ships from across the Mediterranean. Its streets mixed merchants, bureaucrats, monks, students, and street preachers. And it still had a reputation that carried weight. Alexandria was a place where ideas mattered. But it was also a city where factions fought in the open. Riots weren't rare accidents, they were part of civic life. Power was never only what the law said, it was also what you could mobilize in the streets. In that city lived Hypatia, teacher, mathematician, philosopher, and eventually a target. Hypatia is sometimes presented as the last great scholar of antiquity, but the more revealing description is simpler. She was a public intellectual in a city where public life was turning violent. Her story is not only about learning, it's about what happens when learning becomes entangled with authority, resentment, rumor, and political struggle. By Hypatia's lifetime, the famous Library of Alexandria as a single institution was long gone, but the city's intellectual ecosystem remained. Private schools taught rhetoric and philosophy, students traveled to Alexandria to learn how to speak, reason, and lead. Education wasn't a secluded hobby, it was a civic skill. Hypatia likely was born in the later 4th century, perhaps around 355 to 370 CE. Her father, Theon, was a mathematician known for editing and teaching scientific texts. He trained his daughter in a way most girls were never trained, and Hypatia grew into a figure rare even among learned men of her time, a teacher whose name carried prestige across the city. She taught philosophy in the Neoplatonic tradition. That label can sound abstract, but for her students it meant discipline, how to argue cleanly, how to distinguish appearance from reality, how to train the mind toward order. Philosophy was also a social identity. To study it was to join an elite that prized reasoned debate and civic poise. Hypatia also taught mathematics and astronomy, the hard tools of the ancient curriculum. Mathematics meant proofs and structure, not just calculation. Astronomy meant the models that organized calendars, navigation, and the rhythms of public time. Later references connect Hypatia to commentaries on major technical works, texts associated with figures like Diophantus, Apollonius, and Ptolemy. Much of her writing is lost, but her reputation suggests she could make difficult material teachable, and that she did something essential in any intellectual tradition. She kept knowledge alive by keeping it understandable. So why would a scholar become caught in lethal politics? Because Alexandria was changing, and not gently. The Roman Empire did not collapse everywhere at once. In Alexandria, imperial administration still functioned. Taxes were collected, courts operated, and the prefect, the emperor's top official in the city, had legal authority. But alongside that bureaucratic power stood another center of influence that was rising fast, the church. Christianity was now dominant in the empire, and the Bishop of Alexandria was not only a spiritual figure, he was a political actor with networks, money, patronage, and, most crucially, street power. A bishop could rally crowds, pressure officials through allies, and shape public opinion from the pulpit. In a city where street action often decided outcomes, this was real power. When Cyril became Bishop of Alexandria in 412 CE, he inherited a volatile city. Christians divided among themselves, a long-established Jewish community, lingering pagan civic identities, and deep tension between religious authority and imperial governance. Cyril was ambitious and forceful. The prefect Orestes represented the emperor. Two power centers now competed for the right to define order in Alexandria, and in that kind of contest, neutrality becomes difficult. Hypatia, in this environment, was not outside politics. She belonged to the civic elite, respected, consulted, connected. Sources suggest she had a relationship with Orestes, and that her counsel was valued. Even if she held no office, she carried something powerful in a city of competing loyalties: credibility.
and credibility can become dangerous when rival factions believe influence decides everything. This is where the story is often oversimplified. It's tempting to frame Hypatia's death as science versus religion, but the conflict in Alexandria was less about whether knowledge mattered and more about who controlled the city. Many Christians valued learning. Some Christian students admired Hypatia. The deeper issue was sovereignty. Who could command loyalty, punish enemies, and set the terms of public life? Religion supplied the language of legitimacy, but the engine underneath was power. As the rivalry between Cyril's supporters and Orestes' administration intensified, street violence became a tool. One flashpoint involved militant monks brought into the city, clashes with the prefect's party, and the death of a monk who became a rallying symbol. The message to the streets was unmistakable. There were martyrs, villains, and enemies, and Alexandria was choosing sides. In that climate, rumors about Hypatia spread. Hostile accounts accused her of magic and manipulation, ancient shorthand for influence that feels illegitimate or hard to explain. If someone's authority can't be controlled by law or office, it becomes easy to label it unnatural. And once a person is cast as a hidden obstacle, removing them can feel to a faction like a political solution. Alexandria's streets rewarded certainty, not nuance. In a city where crowds could swing a dispute, words became weapons. When negotiations failed, it became tempting to blame a single person for blocking peace. Hypatia, prominent, pagan, publicly respected, and close to the prefect, became a screen for resentment. She was also a woman with exceptional public authority in a culture built for male leadership, and that made her visibility even sharper, even easier to twist into suspicion. The tragedy is that her life had been about order, clean reasoning, measured debate, teaching people to see past noise, but the city around her was moving in the opposite direction. When institutions weaken, rumor gets stronger. When trust collapses, accusation feels like proof. And when politics becomes existential, when each side believes it is fighting for survival, independent figures stop looking like neutral teachers and start looking like liabilities.
In March of 415 CE, a mob seized Hypatia as she traveled through the city. Accounts differ in detail, but the broad outline is consistent and horrifying. She was dragged to a public building associated with the church, stripped, and murdered brutally. Her body was mutilated and burned outside the city. It was not a quiet assassination. It was public violence designed to broadcast dominance, to show who owned the streets and who did not. In the classical city, prestige was supposed to protect you. Education was supposed to earn respect. Civic disputes were supposed to be managed by debate, patronage, and law. Hypatia's murder announced that those assumptions were no longer reliable. It told Alexandria's educated class, your learning will not shield you if you are perceived as standing in the way of a new order. What happened next revealed how difficult it was to reverse that kind of breakdown. There was outrage, and later writers often treated the killing as a disgrace. Cyril's exact responsibility is debated. Direct command is hard to prove, but the atmosphere that made the murder possible was undeniably political, and Cyril's faction benefited from the outcome. Imperial authorities investigated, yet Alexandria was too strategic and too volatile for easy solutions. In an empire already strained, punishment could become another spark. Hypatia's death became a turning point in memory, not because scholarship ended overnight, but because her killing showed how a city could stop protecting shared civic life. When violence can silence a prominent teacher without decisive consequences, everyone else learns the lesson. Safety depends on factions, not principles. And once people learn that lesson, they behave differently. They speak differently. They teach differently. They choose safer topics. They avoid public controversy. The intellectual climate changes, even if the books remain. That is why Hypatia still resonates. She stands at an uncomfortable crossroads between an older Mediterranean civic culture and a newer, more centralized religious authority, between persuasion and coercion, between the hope that truth convinces and the reality that power often doesn't have to be convinced. Her story forces a blunt question. In a crisis, who gets blamed? Hypatia did not command troops, she did not sit on a throne, yet she carried intellectual authority, and in a city where legitimacy was contested, that was enough. When public trust collapses, rumor becomes stronger than evidence. When institutions weaken, mobs become substitutes for courts. And when politics becomes existential, the line between rival and enemy disappears. In a collapsing city, Hypatia tried to keep a space open for clarity. Alexandria answered with violence, and the shadow of that answer, how quickly learning can be labeled partisan, how easily influence can be called magic, how fast civic conflict can turn into moral crusade, has repeated in different forms ever